Here is a fact that nobody in Nigerian media is discussing. Every major escalation of Boko Haram activity between 2009 and 2015 coincided almost perfectly with a Nigerian election cycle. Not once, not twice, 5 times. And yet, the conversation never moved from mosques and madrasas to boardrooms and budget lines. Why? While every Nigerian is debating whether this is a Muslim problem or a Christian problem, a northern problem or a southern problem, nobody is asking who profits when Nigeria bleeds. Nobody is following the money. Before this video ends, I will show you a structure, a specific documented pattern that connects political godfathers, security budget leakages, and insurgency timelines in a way that is not a conspiracy theory. It is a calendar. So the real question is not, why do these groups exist? The real question is, why are they still allowed to exist? Before we go further, if you are new here, Naija Update 24/7 exists for one reason: to give every Nigerian, wherever you are, whatever region you are from, the political analysis that mainstream media won't touch. Hit subscribe and stay with me. This gets deeper. To understand why this conversation is resurging right now, you need to understand what has shifted in the last 18 months. Recent security disclosures, statements by former military chiefs, whistleblower accounts from within the DSS, and leaked National Security Council documents now circulating in academic and policy circles have reignited a debate that powerful people in Abuja would prefer stayed buried. The debate is no longer about whether these groups are dangerous. Everyone agrees they are. The debate is now about who made them possible and who kept them sustainable. International bodies have added fuel to this fire. The UN panel of experts on Lake Chad Basin, in reports covering 2022 through 2024, flagged internal financing networks, not just foreign Salafist funding, as a primary mechanism keeping armed non-state actors alive in the north. That is a UN panel saying in diplomatic language that the money sustaining Boko Haram and bandit groups is not all coming from outside Nigeria. Some of it is coming from inside, from people with Nigerian addresses, Nigerian bank accounts, Nigerian political connections. The people driving this conversation into the open are a convergence of civil society organizations, investigative journalists at outlets like Humangle and The Cable, and retired security officials who are no longer protected by active service and have chosen to speak. These are not radicals. These are people who sat in the rooms. Why now specifically? 2 reasons. First, the Tinubu administration's security restructuring has forced uncomfortable questions about what the old structure was actually designed to protect. When you restructure a system, you expose what the old structure was hiding. Second, and this is the reason that should concern every Nigerian, the 2027 election cycle is approaching. Historical pattern is clear. Insurgency intensity spikes in pre-election years. Analysts are watching the calendar. You should too. The historical foundation here is important to establish briefly. Boko Haram's formal militarization began in 2009 under the Yaradua administration. By some documented accounts, early financing flowed through informal channels connected to politicians whose interest was destabilizing the Jonathan transition, not theology. Northwest banditry accelerated sharply between 2018 and 2020 under conditions where state police capacity was being deliberately underfunded rather than strengthened. Herdsmen violence in the Middle Belt did not emerge from nowhere. It followed the quiet collapse of the National Grazing Reserve Commission, whose funding was redirected without explanation and without replacement. Once you understand that timeline, you have to ask a harder question. What institutions were supposed to stop this, and were they structured to succeed or structured to look busy? The Department of State Services, the DSS, is constitutionally mandated to handle internal intelligence. That is its entire purpose. So the question worth sitting with is this: why has the DSS threat assessment capability consistently lagged behind escalation events rather than preceding them? Every attack, every kidnapping, every community massacre, the intelligence community responds. It rarely warns. For an organization whose budget has grown substantially across every administration, that pattern is not accidental, it is architectural. The Office of the National Security Advisor, the ONSA, is supposed to coordinate all the security agencies. What multiple administrations have done instead is use that office to consolidate intelligence rather than distribute it. The ONSA under this model becomes a political instrument. Intelligence flows up to the president and stops there rather than flowing across agencies to enable operational response. Single-point bottlenecks do not serve counterinsurgency operations, they serve political control. Then there is the Nigerian army, whose counterinsurgency mandate under Operation Lafia Dole ran for years with documented budget anomalies. Aircraft procured that never arrived, armored vehicles paid for that never delivered, ammunition budgeted that disappeared between the Ministry of Finance and the front line. These are not rumors. These are findings from legislative hearings and auditors' reports that were published, received, and then quietly buried. And this brings us to the single most important institutional concept in this entire analysis, the security vote. Security votes are classified budget allocations, money that goes into the security sector with no appropriation requirement, no audit trail, and no legislative oversight. Every tier of government in Nigeria operates them, federal, state, and local. They have grown from the 50 billion naira range in 2009 to over 2 trillion naira equivalent by 2023. Constitutionally unaccountable, operationally untraceable, politically extremely useful. Section 14 sub 2b of the 1999 Constitution states that the security and welfare of the people shall be the primary purpose of government. That is not aspirational. It is a constitutional obligation. The National Security Agencies Act establishes the DSS, the NIA, and the DIA, but contains no civilian oversight mechanism with functional teeth. The Terrorism Prevention Act of 2011, amended in 2013, criminalizes the financing of terrorism, but its prosecution thresholds are set so high that not a single sponsor of terrorism, as distinct from foot soldier, has been convicted under it in over a decade of its existence. Now here is what most Nigerians do not know. In 2021, the Auditor General of the Federation flagged 4.4 trillion naira in unretired security expenditures across 5 years. That report was submitted to the National Assembly. It was received, it was formally filed, and nothing happened. No prosecution, no investigation, no press conference, nothing. When institutions fail this consistently, this predictably, you have to stop calling it failure. You have to start asking, who designed this system and what exactly were they designing it to do? Remember I told you there was a calendar. Here it is. In 2011, Boko Haram bombings peaked in the period immediately following the election result announcement. The target was the destabilization of Goodluck Jonathan's consolidation of power. In 2015, the Chibok kidnapping happened in April 2014, 11 months before the election. The international attention it generated was weaponized as a regime change narrative that served specific political interests. In 2019, Zamfara banditry peaked precisely as governor races in the northwest turned into hostage negotiation contests between political actors and armed commanders. In 2023, pre-election violence in Plateau and Benue suppressed voter turnout in historically opposition-leaning zones. The pattern across all 4 cycles is the same. Violence concentrates where electoral outcomes are uncertain or contested, and it reduces when the political negotiations that follow elections are concluded. This is not a partisan accusation. This is structural analysis. So let us be precise about who benefits. Political incumbents benefit when voter turnout is depressed in opposition strongholds. Security sector elites benefit because their budget authority expands with every crisis. More insecurity justifies more unaccountable spending. Arms procurement networks, both domestic and foreign, operate on conflict as a business model, and land acquisition interests in the Middle Belt and Northwest benefit in a way that most people never discuss. Conflict creates displacement, and displacement creates land availability at zero market cost. Communities that flee do not hold title. The land becomes available to those with the legal instruments and the political protection to claim it. Who risks losing if genuine peace is achieved? Any administration that achieves real security loses the justification for unaccountable security budgets. Political actors whose regional influence depends on being the negotiators between communities and armed groups lose all their leverage the moment those groups are dismantled. Peace, for some people in the Nigerian political structure, is professionally ruinous. Now, and this is crucial for every Nigerian watching regardless of where you are from, this is not a northern problem exported to the south. Southern politicians have financed cult violence in Delta and River states using structurally identical methods. Armed proxy groups deployed in election periods, then abandoned once the votes are counted. The mechanism is national, only the costume changes. Herdsmen in the Middle Belt, cult in Rivers, bandit in Zamfara, militant in the Delta. Same architecture, different uniform. There's also a foreign dimension to the silent stakeholders in this crisis. Certain transnational business interests, particularly in agricultural land, solid minerals, and informal resource extraction, benefit directly from ungoverned spaces in Nigeria. And there is a category of foreign government, I will name the category, not the country, because the evidence here is institutional, not conspiratorial, whose diplomatic communications have consistently downplayed Nigerian state capacity to handle insurgency. Ask yourself this question seriously. Why would any foreign government want Nigeria to believe it cannot solve its own security problem? We will come back to that. Now, if what I just told you surprises you, drop a comment below. I want to know what you think before we get to the part that changes everything. Once you understand who benefits, the national question becomes, what does this cost the rest of us, every Nigerian who is not in that room? The first cost is to Nigeria's federalism itself. When the federal government controls both the security architecture and the off-budget security votes, state governors in conflict zones become dependent clients rather than independent executives. They are forced to negotiate with Abuja and sometimes with the armed groups themselves rather than govern their states. Federalism in Nigeria is being hollowed out not through constitutional amendment, but through fear, through financial dependency, through the quiet understanding that a governor who does not cooperate with the security establishment will find his state suddenly more insecure than his neighbors. The economic cost falls on every Nigerian household. The World Bank in 2023 estimated that insecurity in the Northwest and Northeast has displaced over 3.1 million people internally, creating a humanitarian burden absorbed entirely by the Nigerian public sector and international aid budgets. The Benue, Plateau, Zamfara, Borno corridor represents over 30% of Nigeria's domestic food production capacity. When that corridor is in conflict, agricultural output collapses, supply chains break, and the food prices that every family in Lagos, Port Harcourt, Enugu, and Kano pay every morning at the market are partly a downstream product of that violence. Insecurity in the north is not a northern problem, it is structurally inflationary for all Nigerians. There is also a longer-term cost that is harder to quantify, but may be the most dangerous of all. When elite-engineered violence is consistently branded as religious or ethnic conflict, it deposits real hatred between communities that had coexisted for generations. The Plateau State crisis is the most documented example of this dynamic. Christian-Muslim violence there intensified precisely in the periods when political actors needed the Middle Belt destabilized. The violence was real, the blood was real, the grief was real, but the framing, the insistence that this was a religious war, served an elite interest, not a community one. Every cycle of that framing makes the next cycle of genuine reconciliation harder to achieve. And a generation of young men in the Northwest have now been socialized into armed group structures for years. Demobilization without economic alternatives and genuine reintegration is not peace. It is a pause with a countdown. Here is the figure that nobody in Nigerian media quotes regularly. Nigeria spends more per capita on security than any other nation in West Africa and has the worst security outcomes on the continent by multiple metrics. At some point, that gap between expenditure and outcome stops being incompetence. It starts being a policy choice. Nigeria does not exist in a vacuum. The forces shaping this crisis have addresses outside Abuja. Let us go there. The category of foreign government that benefits from Nigerian security dependence is this: bilateral security partners, governments that supply Nigeria with training, equipment, and intelligence, whose commercial interests in Nigeria are protected by Nigeria's continued need for that partnership. If Nigeria could solve its own security crisis independently, the leverage those partnerships provide would collapse. That leverage is worth billions in trade concessions, contract preferences, and diplomatic positioning. This is not anti-Western sentiment, it is institutional analysis grounded in documented behavior. The United States, France, and the United Kingdom have each at different moments delayed or conditioned security cooperation in ways that served their own policy interests more than Nigeria's operational needs. France's historical Sahel strategy, documented in European Parliament reports, included efforts to keep the Lake Chad Basin ungoverned as a buffer against Chinese infrastructure expansion into Central Africa. Nigeria's insecurity was a geopolitical instrument. Its people were a variable, not a priority. The regional picture compounds this. The ECOWAS security framework has been structurally weakened by 3 military coups in the Sahel, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Naija, all of which share borders with Nigeria. This is a regional architecture shift that isolates Nigeria as the last significant democratic anchor in the sub-region and increases the pressure on Abuja to accommodate rather than confront armed actors operating across those borders. For Nigerians in the UK, the United States, and across the diaspora, this dimension matters personally. Your remittances, over $20 billion annually, flow into an economy being deliberately destabilized by domestic elites. Your money is not neutral in this equation. And when Nigeria is framed internationally as a failed security state, it shapes how Nigerian children in London and Houston are perceived, how visa applications are assessed, how business partnerships are formed. The security crisis at home has a passport. It travels. Some people will push back on everything in this analysis. Let us give the strongest objections the serious treatment they deserve. The first objection is that poverty and unemployment are the real drivers, that desperate young men with no economic options are simply doing what survival demands. This is a partial truth, and partial truths are the most dangerous kind. Poverty is the recruitment environment. It is not the organizational architecture. Armed groups with procurement networks, communication infrastructure, territorial control, and external financing channels are not spontaneous uprisings of desperate individuals. They are managed enterprises. Poverty explains the foot soldier. It does not explain the supply chain, the command structure, or who negotiates the ransoms. The second objection is that ideology is the real cause, that Boko Haram is a genuinely religious movement, and that dismissing the theological dimension is naive. The ideology is absolutely real for the foot soldier. For the sponsor, it is a management tool. Documented evidence supports this clearly. Several bandit commanders in Zamfara have explicitly rejected religious framing during negotiations with state governments. What they negotiated were land rights and cattle corridors, not theology, resources. And Boko Haram's original 2009 political demands centered on northern political marginalization, a legitimate grievance that elite actors chose to cultivate rather than resolve, because a resolved grievance cannot be weaponized. The third objection is that these are isolated security failures rather than coordinated strategy. This is the easiest objection to address with evidence. Isolated failures produce random distribution. What the data shows is patterned distribution, violence concentrated in electoral battlegrounds, intensified in pre-election windows, reduced when political negotiations conclude. The Auditor General's own retired expenditures, the procurement scandals, the institutionalized impunity for financiers, these do not accumulate by accident. Accidents do not repeat with this precision across 5 election cycles. And to the claim that this is a northern problem for northern people to solve, the financing of this crisis is national. The political beneficiaries span every geopolitical zone. The economic cost falls on every Nigerian family, regardless of region. North, South, East, West, every Nigerian has a stake in dismantling this system. Not because we agree on everything, but because the elite that sponsors insecurity in Borno today can deploy the exact same instrument in Ogun or Anambra tomorrow. The mechanism is portable. The solution must be national. So we come back to where we started. That question I asked you at the beginning. Why are these groups still allowed to exist? Not because Nigeria lacks the military capacity to dismantle them, Operation Harding Eye demonstrated that capacity is real. Not because the intelligence doesn't exist, the DSS has filed threat assessments proving foreknowledge of specific attacks. These groups persist because someone at the top of the Nigerian political structure has decided that the cost of eliminating them is higher than the cost of managing them. That is not an accusation. It is the only conclusion the documented evidence supports. The solution is not military alone, it is institutional. Accountability for security votes, civilian oversight of intelligence agencies with functional enforcement mechanisms, prosecution of financiers under the existing Terrorism Prevention Act, not foot soldiers, financiers, and a political culture that stops rewarding the engineers of managed chaos by returning them to office every 4 years. Nigeria has everything it needs to solve this problem. The military capacity is there, the legal framework exists, the intelligence exists. What Nigeria lacks, what we must collectively demand, is the political will to stop profiting from the problem. Tell me in the comments, do you believe any Nigerian administration, given how deeply this system is embedded, can actually dismantle it from the inside? I want to read your thinking. If this analysis gave you clarity, share it with one Nigerian who needs to understand what is really happening. Like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Naija Update 24/7. We never stop watching.